This episode of Bullet Heaven was made using Pack-a-Punch SCART cables from Retro Gaming Cables, the OSSC from Video Game Perfection, and the Retrobit 2.5 GHz Wireless Saturn controller from Stone Age Gamer. We started with a legend. Now it's time to end with one. This has probably been the most expensive series in Bullet Heaven history, and while some have upheld their reputations, others have not. But now it's finally time to put a question to rest that many of you have had over the last 11 years. How does Hyper Duel stack up? Between games like Thunder Force 2, 3, and 4, as well as Elemental Master, and to a lesser extent in this context, Herzog's Vi, Technosoft's lineup has always carried a bit of prestige with each of its titles. Perhaps most of all, Hyper Duel has become an essential title in the eyes of most, a holy grail to others, with some boldly claiming that it is in fact the best shooting game the Saturn has yet seen. But is it really?
Hyper Duel is a Yoko shmup developed by Technosoft and first released to arcades in October 1993. It would later be ported to the Sega Saturn in November of 1996, complete with a newly overhauled, updated Saturn version as the main feature. Their first original Saturn outing, Hyper Duel is another one of those games where people assume price equals fun or quality, and maybe even the ultimate example of this on the Saturn. Well, we're gonna see what's really up. Let's take a closer look.
At its core, Hyper Duel features a very familiar concept, one we've seen before in games like Aeroflash, and of course, like every Macross game ever made. Players control a transforming mecha called the Buster Gear to take on and destroy their opposition. On the outset, players can select from 3 of these, and each one features different fire patterns and special attacks for both their fighter and mecha forms. Their shot power and general speed also differs from one another, but still allows for decent destructive capability and movement rates regardless of who is chosen. We don't like Lloyd's super short-range business, though.
Hyper Duel implements a very simple control scheme. Movement is swift via typical 8-way control, but transformation and fire revolves around only 2 buttons in a fairly clever way. Pressing the A button on a Saturn pad will fire the player's guns in fighter mode, which features linear fire. If the player is in the mecha-style armor mode, they'll immediately change back to fighter. Meanwhile, the B button fires the armor mode's weapons. The armor mode shots will sweep up or down based on player movement, but can be locked in place with the R button. This weapon lock is only available in the Saturn version. If the player is in fighter mode, they'll immediately change to armor. This makes for a confusion-free, streamlined attack and transformation system that's easy to grasp.
As with many shooters of its kind, there's a progressive weapon system here as well, allowing for players to upgrade their fire to a maximum level of 4. Not only does the main gun fire bigger, badder shots, missiles are also added to the mix, which can be helpful in dealing damage behind the player in fighter mode. As is typically the case, if a player loses a life, their power level will be reduced, and further power-ups will need to be collected. Many of these red P icons exist throughout most stages in the game, allowing for at least a decent recovery should the player end up getting clipped.
Of course, it also goes further. When in any given mode, pressing both buttons while already firing will engage the Buster Gear's bomber fire. This heightens the Buster Gear's fire output in different ways, depending on the mode the player is in at the time. When in fighter mode, bomber fire will shoot in all directions, making enemy crowd control much more manageable. This is especially helpful when surrounded or when enemies hide in tight areas that linear fire might not be able to reach especially well. When in armor mode though, bomber fire is shot down the player's line of fire, greatly enhancing the Buster Gear's offensive output.
Bomber fire is tied to a gauge which is found on the player's respective side of the screen along the bottom edge. It will deplete as players continue to use it. This gauge will fill up over time but can be filled significantly with a bomber pickup, indicated with a B. So long as some power exists in this gauge, the player will be able to use bomber fire, which allows for a lot of flexibility when the time comes to actually use it. Of course, careful bomber management should always be kept in mind in the case of frequent or constant use.
But there's more. Additional buddy units can be summoned to assist the player in their mission by collecting a pickup that cycles between two letters. The fighter-type tracer unit is summoned when the T is displayed. It generally fires in a linear fashion like the Buster Gear's fighter form. The gunner unit will appear when a G is displayed, and these small mechas will chase down enemy units and bosses autonomously while firing in any direction to more easily take out foes above and below them. While these units can be destroyed through enemy and bullet collision, numerous units can be summoned throughout each stage, adding a decent amount of player support and even defense. There are issues though, which we'll get into shortly.
Hyper Duel plays over the course of 8 stages, both in Saturn and arcade mode. A lot of these stages are a little on the short side though, so the time spent playing them from beginning to end isn't necessarily that long. We've definitely played games with fewer stages for longer periods of time end to end. With multiple options for lives, continues, and difficulty, Hyper Duel should present a good challenge for novices playing without getting unfairly hard. To that end, this might be a better starting point than even Thunder Force 5 for newcomers looking to get into Technosoft shooters. But advanced players are definitely going to want to ratchet the difficulty to hard or very hard. The inclusion of a 2-player cooperative mode is also present, which we believe is actually a Technosoft first.
Even with all of the solid gameplay, we had a few issues with Hyper Duel. Namely, it was really hard to see some enemy shots when things got crowded with enemies, 2 players and their shots, helpers with their shots, and busy backgrounds. More than once we questioned what hit us. The helpers are also a bit of a sticking point. Not so much the unit themselves, as they are a decent addition. More so collecting the power-ups is wonky. We prefer the gunners to tracers, and more than once we got a tracer when the G was still firmly in the gunner cycle. It sure would have been nice if, the right unit was deployed when the letter in question was being displayed. At the very least, there is no discernible slowdown in Hyper Duel. It runs large and fast throughout the entire game, which has got to count for something.
With all of this in mind though, does it really deserve the hype? Is it honestly worthy of this whole grail status? Well, no, not especially. And we know this is going to anger a lot of you, but hear us out. There's no denying that this is a decently fun game, and the control scheme is absolutely refined and pretty good. But the whole concept is definitely nothing new. With fewer mechanics than the Thunder Force series, less nuance than the later Blast Wind, and a basic rudimentary power-up system that countless other shooters have incorporated, the gameplay, while solid, doesn't feel special as a result. Perhaps worst of all, whether the game is credit-fed or 1cc'd from easy to very hard, there's no difference in stage progression, no true last boss, and no alternate endings. Especially among Saturn greats like Sokyu Grentai and Radiant Silvergun, it just doesn't measure up from a survival, gameplay, or replayability standpoint. But what about its scoring? Hyper Duel is also on the simple side with its scoring system. It isn't even really set up in such a way that anything fancy could be implemented. But in a strange twist, the player's score will constantly increase as long as the player does not move their Buster Gear. Move and the counter stops. Finding a safe spot can help in boosting the player's score in this respect, but it's not an especially reliable source for pointage. Of course, most of the player's score in any given stage will simply come from enemy destruction. Just destroy as much as possible while moving as little as possible. I guess? It's weird.
Where the player will score big is in the stage end phase. At the end of a given stage, players will receive up to 4 significant bonuses. A stage clear bonus of 10,000 points multiplied by the stage number, a stock bonus of 10,000 points for every helper unit still in play, a perfect bonus of 30,000 points if all enemies in a given stage are destroyed, and finally, a special bonus of up to 50,000 points dependent on the amount of power left in the bomber fire gauge.
Players can also obtain extra points for collecting power-ups past maximum power and from special crystals in Stage 5 that grow in value to a maximum of 10,000 points apiece. These are definitely helpful in hitting the first extend score of 500,000 points. A second extend can also be earned at 1.5 million.
Players can rank in on a local leaderboard that is saved to the Saturn's internal memory or a memory cartridge. Players have 5 letters to work with, which is nice. Also, there are whales. Of course, no online scores exist here, but at the very least, it can be maintained for players to show off their exploits.
Hyper Duel may not be the most challenging shooter around, but it definitely picks up points with its presentation, especially with regards to the Saturn Arrange version.
That said, the arcade version of Hyper Duel is missing a certain something visually. The color is more bland, most explosions have way more green than we would have expected, and the user interface is much simpler. Even selecting the player's buster gear is much less flashy, with a simpler pixel art style character portrait and some sprites used in the main game representing each selectable ship. On the whole, it works, but it's definitely not the prettiest way to play the game. The good news is that the Saturn Arrange version has much more color, a cooler selection screen, an FMV opening movie, better backgrounds, better sprites, better animation, and better explosion effects. It all looks and runs very well, which is a definite plus.
From a design standpoint, the player ships and bosses are still really cool, regardless of the version played. Players and sprites are very big, featuring a ton of detail in both fighter and armored modes. Once again, the Saturn Arrange mode shines with much better color overall, but we did feel that the play area was very claustrophobic. The enemies are pretty big too, and with the player's relatively high speed paired with the narrower areas in several stages, the game feels a lot more crowded as a result. The Tracers and Gunners are a closer match in size to many of the shooters found on the Saturn, and there's probably a good reason for that. So, while admittedly pretty sweet, these giant sprites are nonetheless fairly impractical.
The sound also suffers in the arcade version of Hyper Duel. While the Tsukumo compositions are still very good, they don't sound nearly as clean or as full as the Saturn Arrange version. We're sure the arcade version's soundtrack has its fans, but for our money, the arranged version is where it's at. We do have issues with the sound balance though. The music at the ship selection screen is very, very low and ends up being buried by the selection effects. The sound effects in general are also kind of rough. They tend to drown out the stage music quite a bit, though less so than the ship select. They're also often very washed out sounding, much like Blast Wind would be later down the line. In the end, they're serviceable, but a bit uncomfortable to listen to at higher volumes.
Hyper Duel's options have a neat interface with a dip switch style system for adjusting the game's difficulty, number of lives, credits, and more. The options menu is also where players will find the controller config, a sound test, ranking display, and more, all with a cool pre-render of one of the buster gears. It's all very Technosoft and we dig it.
But we have another sticking point we need to address: the general plot and its flow. We know that a lot of shooters are very light on story, but there's not a ton here to make this feel like an epic mission of any kind. There's no prologue outside of the manual, no epilogue in the game's ending, and the events that take place between stages 4 and 8 offer no explanation as to why one of the bosses chooses to help the player. Stuff basically happens just because it can. The events that end up unfolding almost seem as if there were planned scenes between stages, but they were just kind of abandoned. The lack of a true last boss and no alternate endings for good performance through a 1cc regardless of difficulty makes Hyper Duel feel much more generic than a lot of others on the Saturn as a result.
So while Hyper Duel still has shortcomings in its presentation, it's still at least objectively good, especially in its design, visuals, and music. But when it all comes together, how does Hyper Duel stack up? Let's take a look. Hyper Duel's controls are spot on, with a simple, intuitive structure.
The Saturn Arrange mode holds the clear edge by adding a lock function to the armor mode's fire.
As far as shmups on the Saturn go, Hyper Duel is one of the easier games we've played.
There are a lot of safe spots and clear patterns for players to exploit. Despite this, players can still get overwhelmed by crowded screens hiding enemy shots.
It may have 8 stages, but Hyper Duel still manages to be fairly short.
Add to that the same ending and no true last boss for 1cc's, regardless of difficulty, and Hyper Duel's staying power is fairly weak.
The Saturn Arrange mode's visuals are almost the strongest part of this entire package.
Again though, the visuals can get pretty cluttered at times, hiding enemy shots and resulting in confusing deaths.
Hyper Duel has an excellent Tsukumo soundtrack,
but the loud, washed-out sound effects and iffy sound balance will often drown it out.
Hyper Duel's control scheme is probably the most ingenious aspect to the entire game. Everything else is startlingly basic.
From the transforming mechs to the simple scoring, there's nothing here that hasn't been done before in other titles before it. It's definitely good, but not legendarily great.
Hyper Duel currently sits atop a lofty throne made of fat stacks of cash. No other shmup on the Saturn commands the kinds of extreme prices Hyper Duel does, and it could never ever be worth the prices it currently commands.
But what if playing Hyper Duel is high on your list of priorities? Well, we're not saying you should investigate alternative methods of procuring this title, but buying it is a complete waste of cash. It's just nowhere near $600 good, much less $1,000.
We've got to level with you all, the hype surrounding this game is completely unwarranted. Technosoft was an excellent developer, and having played the vast majority of their titles to date, we can confidently say that while it's nowhere near their worst game, it's definitely not their best either. It has some serious flaws. The stages are very short, the screen can get too busy for its own good, and the excellent music gets drowned out by loud, breathy effects. Yet, it's still very playable, albeit with an inherent simplicity. Despite this, in the end, we just can't grasp the reason this game is so highly revered. When the chips are down and the dust is settled, Hyper Duel gets a 3.75 out of 5. If you'd like to take out a second mortgage on your home, maybe sell your car or skip out on rent and or utilities, you can get your very own copy of Hyper Duel at auction. But like, seriously, don't do it for the prices people want nowadays, holy jumpin'. Well, that wraps things up for Series 11, and we fully expect a lot of unsubs over this, but like, what do you want? Over $600, and all we got was broken promises. Basically, you can do much better than Hyper Duel, even on the Saturn and even still from Technosoft themselves. Just, I don't know, get Thunder Force 5 instead, it's affordable and excellent.
Series 12 begins in October, starting with yet another heavy-hitting title. Ibarra for PlayStation 2 is coming up in episode 281 of Bullet Heaven. We hope to see you all there.
Are you still here? Wait just a bit longer.